Hello and welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. US President Donald Trump hopes that Iran should enter into nuclear negotiations with the United States of America. And he has said that he has sent a letter to Iran's leadership and expected Iran to enter into negotiations. Let me quote some excerpts of what exactly he said to during a TV interview. There are two ways Iran can be handled: militarily, or you make a deal. I would prefer to make a deal because I'm not looking to hurt Iran. They are great people. I said, I hope you're going to negotiate because it's going to be a lot better for Iran. I think they want to get that letter. The other alternative is we have to do something because you can't let another nuclear weapon, unquote. There has been a response on the part of the Iranian side. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, said, let me quote him, "Some bully governments insist on negotiations, but their negotiations are not aimed at solving issues, but to dominate and impose their own expectations. For them, negotiations is a mean to introduce new demands. The issue is not just about nuclear matters. They raise new expectations that Iran will certainly not accept. They demand restrictions on the country's defensive capabilities and international influence. Don't do this, don't meet that person, don't produce that item, or your missile range should not exceed a certain limit," unquote. We have also seen Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi saying, let me quote, "We will not enter any direct negotiations with the US so long as they continue their maximum pressure policy and their threats," unquote. Another statement that came from Iran's UN mission, let me quote that also. "If the objective of the negotiations is to address concerns vis-a-vis any potential militarization of Iran's nuclear program, such discussions may be subject to consideration. However, should the aim be the dismantlement of Iran's peaceful nuclear program, to claim that what Obama failed to achieve has now been accomplished, such negotiations will never take place." It is pertinent to mention over here that during his first presidency, it was US President Donald Trump who pulled out of Iran's nuclear deal back in 2018. This particular Iran nuclear deal, also known as Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, which was struck back in 2015. What could be the possible future regarding this particular front when the tensions keep escalating between Iran and the United States of America? Also, we have seen Russia has offered mediation regarding this particular issue. How far-reaching impact that could also have on this particular entire equation. We'll be taking the analysis regarding that. Also for that, we are honored to be joined in the studio by Mr. Jauhar Saleem, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan and President, currently serving as President at the Institute of Regional Studies. Ambassador Saleem, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Also, we are honored to be joined in the studio by Mr. Rear Admiral retired Faisal Shah, senior analyst. Admiral Shah, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. Ambassador Saleem, let's quickly take a stock of this particular Iran nuclear deal. The JCPOA, it was struck P5+1 back in 2015. In 2018, it was Donald Trump who pulled out of this particular deal. But looking at this particular new offer of entering into a negotiation on this particular front and expecting Iran to enter into negotiations, do you see it a shift from his earlier policy, or is it the same extension of the same policy?
It's quite a complex issue, and it's been there since decades now. Like you said, Trump withdrew in his first presidency in 2018 from JCPOA, which had been signed after painstaking negotiations of years in 2015. And the Europeans were very upset. They tried to rescue it, but they couldn't after the US withdrawal and reimposition of sanctions on Iran. Now, there are 4 or 5 elements, I think, which are very critical to this question, which is a very important question for this region. It affects all the countries in the region, including Pakistan, situation in the Middle East, and of course, it has global implications. One is that Trump what he did during his first presidency was very much predicated on Israel's perspective, because Israel had been very much against the JCPOA and all the negotiation. They tried to subvert it, but it couldn't. Eventually, though, when Trump came to power, then Israelis persuaded Trump to withdraw from it. That is one. So the Israeli perspective, that is very important, because Trump is closer to Israeli leadership than the Democrats, the Democratic leadership was. And that has been the case since long. That is one element. So what I mean to say here is that Israel's terms and their perspective becomes very relevant. That is one. Second, the Israelis have been wanting to go for a military option. That is for an airstrike to destroy the nuclear installations in Iran, particularly the Shah, the critical installations there.
Yeah.
And the US has been the country which has been so far successful in persuading them not to do so. In fact, there was some sort of damage to Iran's nuclear installations in the recent sort of exchanges between Iran and Israel, but it was still not really like more superficial than than what the Israelis would want. That's the second dimension. The third dimension is that Iran's deterrence. What was Iran's deterrence? Iran's deterrence against possible American or Israeli strike on its nuclear sites had been what the West calls its proxies in the Middle East, because then they had always promised a massive retaliation. They have all those missiles which we
termed as proxies with the Western nations?
yeah, like
by the US and Israel
and Hamas
and termed as the axis of resistance by Iran.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, those assets, because they fared reaction from those, whatever you call them, those organizations, and also from Iran, because Iran has that missile capacity, and which has been demonstrated recently when they had these exchanges with Israel. But now, what Israelis have accomplished is, in their view, they have really counterfoiled or really taken out much of that capacity. They have inflicted significant damage, as we saw, using their technology and intelligence ingress on Hezbollah, Hamas. We've seen, they claim to have killed 17,000 Hamas operatives, and even Houthis as well. So that's the third dimension. Now, the fourth dimension of it is Trump's style of diplomacy. Trump's style of diplomacy is that he tries to sort of, really push, people can call it blackmail as well, or people can call it pressure tactics. But at the same time, his preference is always to find a deal, to have a deal rather than go for a military option. So that is there. Now, the fifth dimension of this issue is the situation within Iran. And that is very complex as well right now. Within Iran, just as we speak, in recent days, it's very clear that the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, he wanted to negotiate. But the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, he doesn't want to negotiate. And I think it's probably one of the very few times, if not the first time, when the Iranian president has openly stated that I wanted to negotiate, but now that we have been directed by the supreme leader not to negotiate, that is our policy. There's a lot of political instability in Iran right now. The finance minister was, basically dismissed by the parliament. The Vice President Jawad Zarif was dismissed against the wishes of President Masoud Pezeshkian. So that is the one more element which makes the situation complex. Lastly, let's say if Israel or in conjunction with the Americans, although I know that the American preference would be that the strikes don't take place. But let's say if the strikes takes place and these are successful, even let's assuming that, what will happen? There could be nuclear fallout. Like the Qatari leadership has just said that if the Shah installations are destroyed, within 3 days, drinking water in all the Gulf could become undrinkable. There would be no drinking because of the nuclear fallout. So that brings another sort of dimension to this whole issue. But So because of that, I think there's no clear direction here for now. You know, but you know, just to sum it up, Trump's preference would be to desist the Israelis from going for the nuclear strike option, and he would try to go for a deal. But if that doesn't happen, then the Israelis will try to persuade Trump to let them have the nuclear to exercise the nuclear strikes option, and then they will of course insist that America supports them in that.
Very comprehensive discussion regarding very important points. I'll come back to you to discuss every point separately, especially when you specifically talk about the internal situation within Iran. There is a statement by Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei last year. I'll come to that particular statement also. The possibility of a strike, a nuclear strike on part of Israel is in the kind of fallout that it entails. I'll be discussing that one also particularly. Also, when we talk about the Israeli perspective, there are reports on the part of the US intelligence agencies which confirm that Iran is nowhere near acquiring a nuclear weapon, right? So despite that, what made President Trump at that particular time to keep Israeli perspective right in front and pull out of that particular deal? Admiral Shah, when we specifically talk about this Iran nuclear deal, what primarily it entails and what were those features as per your understanding which irked President Trump at that particular time the most, which led him to pull out of that?
Thank you very much. And I agree with Ambassador Jauhar Saleem, but I would like to add something to what all he has said. And one thing pertains to your question also, that why did Trump pull out of JCPOA at that time? The basic premise of Trump administration was that JCPOA did not include Iranian missile program in the deal. So they were adamant on including that into the deal, which Iran resisted, and the P5 also resisted, and I mean other members of the JCPOA negotiating panel, they also resisted, and that's how US pulled out of that deal. Again today, Mr. Trump is insisting on including not only Iranian nuclear program but also the missile program, because that is the delivery system. Without that, your nuclear capability is of no use. So there is no shift in his policy from 2018. It's the same stance that he is carrying on, and that's what he wants Iran to do. Now, Ambassador Jawad Saleem mentioned about Iran's deterrence, and it is true that its deterrence lied in its proxies, and those have been weakened by Israel. But there is another deterrence that Israel enjoys, and that's in Persian Gulf. Its geographical position, suitable geographical position in Persian Gulf, is well suited to disrupt energy trade of the world. 40% of energy supplies go through Strait of Hormuz. 22 million barrels per day pass through Strait of Hormuz, and it's a matter of minutes for Israel to disrupt it. So that is one deterrence so for Iran to disrupt it. And that is one deterrence that Iran still carries on. So while Mr. Trump will be putting on pressure on Iran, Iran will be resisting it, but I believe that both parties will have to find some middle ground, because if both remain stuck to their points, there will be turmoil in the region, and that's why Russia has come into play to mediate. It has offered to mediate because it understands that there has to be a middle ground which Russia can find with both of them. So I feel the situation is not going to be that devastating, but right now, yes.
Okay, so if that particular point, it was so much of concern for the Trump administration at that particular time that JCPOA did not include the missile program, right? It contained, it encompassed only the nuclear program, right? So the delivery system. So the main focus of the Trump administration was there. What at the very first place led all those P5+1 stakeholders to strike that particular deal with Iran? What was the motivation at that particular time?
The motivation was to bring stability to the region and to curtail Iranian nuclear program to a limit, so that if the nuclear program doesn't materialize, the delivery system is also of no use. I mean, delivery system can be used for conventional attacks, but it will not be used for nuclear strikes. So they were focusing primarily on Iranian nuclear capability, and they wanted to limit it to certain limit, certain enrichment value, and they did it. It was successful, but because Mr. Trump's insistence that the missile program should be included in that, I mean, there was no risk at that time, because the nuclear enrichment by Iran was limited to certain value, which was not weapon grade value. But even though,
once President Trump pulled out of that particular deal, so there, the Iranian side surpassed certain limits after that pullout.
yes,
Am I correct on
they
that?
waited for some time. If you go to the analysis, they waited for some time, but then when nobody was listening to them, nobody was paying heed to this abandonment of JCPOA unilaterally by US, so they also started.
So
enriching it.
what do we understand? What sense should we be ideally making out of it? Was it more damaging to the entire equation, the pullout by the US president at that time, that actually pushed Iran to go for further enrichment, or was it largely in the interest of the US and Israel collectively to pull out from that?
I think it was more damaging because Iran was adhering to the directions of IAEA. The regular inspections were being carried out and they were being certified by IAEA. So Iran was hoping to be opening up to the world and world coming, reaching out to Iran for economic prosperity in Iran. But perhaps it was not meant, or it was not it was not the objective of US and Israel to see Iran prospering economically. So perhaps because of that they did it, or perhaps it was their idea to include not only the weapon system but also the delivery system into that. So comprehensively they should limit Iran to certain value.
Right, Ambassador Jawad Saleem. Now, regarding deterrence, what's your take regarding, as Admiral Shah has added one very important aspect, that Strait of Hormuz, the oil route, that remains to be one of the key deterrents out of the two, the one that you already mentioned, that axis of resistance. What about this? What's your understanding? Then I'll come to the other point regarding the internal situation in Iran.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like Commander, like Admiral Faisal said, that those type of deterrences are available to Iran. One is to, of course, to try to block Strait of Hormuz, where 40% of the world trade and particularly the energy trade passes. That's one. The other one is, which they exercised in the past as well. They started attacking Saudi nuclear installations, for instance, So they can basically, that is another sort of deterrence, which, because they would try to disrupt the oil market, and there could be some others as well. Of course, they have those thousands of projectiles with them and they could start launching them at Israel. These are there. But, these would be desperate attempts, These could have some short-term impact. But then, of course, once because the Navy is no match to to the US Navy in the region, and it's, So I think this would be just the temporary measures, desperate measures, and it would be good not to force Iran to that, because it would not be good for global economy and sort of, for the regional stability. Having stated that,
what in case of a nuclear strike? If that happens, do you think that will push Iran to opt for this particular option as well, blocking?
I mean, they'll have to, because in terms of face saving, then of course, and in terms of then retaliation, you have to do whatever you can. But that would not be good for anyone. It would not be good for Iran, because then after that retaliation, there would be further retaliations, right?
So it would have not only the nuclear fallout, but also the economic fallout.
Yeah, a huge economic fallout, and and I think while it would damage others, it would damage Iran the most. So it's probably not the type of options they would like to exercise. Now, I'd just like to recall a couple of things. Like, Admiral Faisal said it rightly, that the Americans, they wanted the missile program to be included. And they also want it now as well. But then there was another thing. At that point, Trump said that in many of his statements. He said, oh, like these Europeans, they are just agreeing to, in some ways, freeze this program. But so far as the program is still there, Iran can always achieve this. And the Israelis were of the same view, they wanted the whole program to be scrapped rather than just sort of, frozen and under IAEA safeguards. Basically, because JCPOA, what it allowed for was 10 years, literally, at that point in time, and then it would have been extendable. Okay, that was one thing. Now, as we don't really have, because the Iranians say they haven't really received the letter yet. We don't really have the details in the letter. But what the conjectures are, that this time President Trump is not just asking for sort of, about the nuclear program and the missile program, but in fact more than that, probably something about human rights as well, and some certain other areas. So this is even the demands, if anything, have increased than before. So that is one thing, making it even more difficult for Iran to sort of, more difficult for Iran to sort of, to accept these terms. That is one thing. But the other is, like I said, what are the Iranian options? Quite frankly, economically, Iran, even as it was able to sort of, diversify its trade and divert some of its trade and everything, but it's in a very difficult situation right now economically. Militarily as well, we know now very clearly, and this is something I had some months ago as well, when people were conjecturing that Iran has the capability for massive retaliations. I had felt at the time that sort of, that is overstated generally, the actual capability is not as much. And now it has become more evident, basically after what happened. The way the Israelis were able to conduct operations within Iran, the intelligence operations, and the way they were able to conduct operations as regards to Iranian, proxies, Hezbollah, for instance, that has really, in many ways, that has sort of, made it very evident that the capacity to retaliate is not as much as it was presupposed earlier. So that basically what it does is that it leaves Iran on a relatively weaker wicket. And I think the Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, because he's a pragmatist, he's also not known as a hardliner, unlike Ibrahim Raisi, who is also thought to be a possibility for, because Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is now 85. So, like Ibrahim Raisi was seen as one of the possible contenders for sort of, successorship. But with this president, it's very different, like this president is relative moderate and sort of, and it's very clear that, that he's not seeing eye to eye in terms of many policies with the sort of, with the supreme leader. So that said, I think now what can happen, like if we come to that in this particular situation, which is pregnant with so many hazards and sort of, like possibilities of instability for not just regional but global. Russian intercession, for instance, as Admiral Saab have mentioned, the Russian offer. Now, the first statement which emerged from Kremlin, after this letter, was that it is not for us to decide; it is for Iran to decide whether they want to negotiate, right? And of course, if they want to negotiate, then then countries can offer the good offices. But at this point in time, it is for Iran to come up with a clear policy. So far as the Iranian nuclear capacity is concerned, I think there's a great deal of ambiguity in that, because one perspective is that the capacity or the capability has advanced to a point where it's almost like where they can assemble a nuclear sort of device within weeks. That is one sort of one segment of analysts feel that. There are others who feel that no, that is not the case. There is even another viewpoint which is very interesting, and that viewpoint is when the Israelis attacked Iran the last time during the exchange that the two countries were having, the military sort of the aerial exchanges, they were able to inflict damage on certain parts of Iran's nuclear installations which have which has basically delayed the possibility of sort of like an early assembly of sort of of a nuclear device. So there are these so nobody knows for sure.
Yeah, so keeping the first option in view for the moment, the capability has advanced. We also saw that after President Trump pulled out of that particular deal, there were official announcements at certain specific times that that certain limits were crossed of enrichment. So do you think pulling out on the part of President Trump at that particular time was more of damaging to the entire equation, or was it more fruitful?
No, at that point in time, when President Trump did that, then a lot of, the Europeans quite clearly felt, and the Americans, the Democrats as well, and many, many other countries in the world, they were trying to impress upon President Trump not to do so. They all felt that the JCPOA was a good agreement because it took care of the basic concerns, primary concerns of sort of Israel and sort of others about Iran becoming a nuclear power. That was one. Secondly, it also took care of the sanctions on Iran, and it was going to bring Iran back in the economic loop. Thirdly, it was very good for the oil prices, for instance. It would have a sort of like a salutary effect on the global sort of markets, so to speak. So it was a very good agreement. It was generally sort of hailed as a great agreement. And actually, a lot of people were very, including the European leadership, including many in sort of within the U.S. In fact, President Biden wanted to revive it, and he tried for that as well, but it was not possible then.
What were the irritants at that particular time? Because over the last 4 years, all the efforts went in vain. What were the major irritants? I'll come back to you. Admiral Shah, now by looking at this particular, firstly, the options Iranian side carry with themselves at this particular point in time, keeping in view what Ambassador Jawad Saleem came up with, that there are economic difficulties there. There's a little bit of a political difficulty within the system in Iran as well. Also militarily, it's been weakened. So overall, what I understand from Ambassador Jawad Saleem's view is that Iran doesn't seem to be at the position of strength at this particular point in time. But keeping in view this particular statement, which has specifically come from Iran's mission at the UN, saying if the objective of negotiations is to address concerns vis-a-vis any potential militarization of Iran's nuclear program, such discussions may be subject to consideration. However, should the aim be the dismantlement of Iran's peaceful nuclear program, to claim that what Obama failed to achieve has now been accomplished, such negotiations will never take place. Ambassador Jauhar, Saleem said that this time around, President Trump's administration is eyeing to have more restrictions in, and that is what exactly Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's statement tells us. Your understanding about that?
The statement from their rep in UN indicates the same thing, that if they are concerned about having the missile program and having the nuclear weapon and mating them and using them, then those assurances can be given by Iran that it's not going to happen. Iran has been saying that our nuclear program is for peaceful purposes, and we don't have any intentions to make it, to militarize it. So if those are the concerns, those concerns can be addressed and certain assurances can be given by Iran. This is what he means.
Right.
And that includes both the weapon system and the delivery system both. But as far as their scrapping out
dismantlement
of dismantlement of complete paraphernalia, nuclear paraphernalia, if that is concerned, that is wished for. I think that for that Iran is not ready, and they have clearly mentioned it. So I said, as I said in the beginning, that there has to be a middle ground that is
prima facie. That is what we understand from this statement. Keeping in view what Ambassador Saleem came up with, that economically, politically and militarily, Iran seems to be at a weaker position at this particular point in time. Do you think they would be able to carry the weight of this particular statement if more pressure is built? As we see more sanctions being imposed, the continuity of that policy of maximum pressure on the part of the US towards Iran?
I think economically, if you see, Iran has the most trade with China, and it's being done in yuan. So it's free of dollars. So sanctions don't affect Iran and China.
Right.
Okay, so it might not affect Iran as much. Recently, Iran.
Well, if I hold you for a second over here, this particular deal was struck for the relief in sanctions. So if
Yes.
there was a relief that was sought in terms of sanctions on the part of Iranians, so we do understand that the sanctions do affect Iranians no matter if they trade in yuan with China.
You are right, but sanctions are there on Iran for the last 30 years. These are since 80s, late 80s or early 90s. Iran is under sanctions since then. So sanctions are there. Iran has been surviving. They have been, I mean, their economy has not been very well, but they have been surviving. There are no debts on Iran. They haven't taken debts from IMF or World Bank or any other country. Yes, there have been investments by countries in Iran, and I told you that the heaviest investment is from China, and their mutual trade is in yuan. So sanctions actually don't affect them. Recently, Iran underwent a strategic agreement with Russia also. So that's more of a political support from Russia to Iran, not military support. So Iran is, I believe, is not that much on a weaker wicket that it should succumb to the pressure of US. Whatever US asks, and Iran goes for that. And in that context, I would reiterate that both will have to find a middle ground.
So what are the options when we keep Iranian side particularly in focus?
I think the options is that Iranians should vie for the re-signing of JCPOA sort of thing, and they should open themselves to the IAEA inspections as they did before, and that's how the world will reach out to them. If Iranian missile program is in context, I think Iran can give assurances with respect to that also, and Ambassador Jauhar has mentioned that during October attack of Israel on Iran, there were certain missile production facilities that were also attacked. So Iran can look into this situation, that if it has to enter into a JCPOA sort of agreement again for the economic prosperity, for stability in the region, for stability inside Iran, I think it can go for certain very specific and concrete assurances to the West, to the US, to enter into such an agreement.
Ambassador Saleem, you already talked of the internal situation within Iran. Now, Masoud Pezeshkian wants to enter into negotiations. As you already quoted him, and there was a restriction as far as the consent from the Supreme Leader is concerned. Last year, there was a statement by Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei. He said there is no harm in engaging with the enemy. What did that mean?
Well, I mean, it seems to be a very open-ended statement, so we don't really know what enemy was referring to there, Ayatollah. But what I will say here is that, firstly, you know, when you have sanctions for decades and decades, what they do to you is, you know, we have to remember that Iran has one of the biggest reserves of oil in the world. That is one thing. It also has it's one of the two countries in the world with the biggest reserves of gas. Without these sanctions, Iran would be a rich country. You know, economically, it would probably be at the same level as you see many other Gulf countries. But because of, you know, when you have sanctions, even if you're able to sell your oil, you have to sell it much, much cheaper than what the international markets would suggest. That is one thing. Secondly, you don't get any investment. You know, Iran's, for instance, their reserves are huge, right? But the actual oil they are producing, you know, in terms of the marketable oil, is very little compared to that. You know, why is that? Because there's a multi-billion-dollar investment required. They need Western technology. Now this, when they signed JCPOA, that was perhaps the biggest factor, biggest inducement for them. Because if all that investment, and that investment more than money is in terms of technology that they need, if that would have come in, their oil production could have matched Saudi Arabia's, you know, and their gas production would have surpassed Qatar's and other countries. And then, you know, the type of revenue, like their revenues in that case, without sanctions and with all that sort of, like investments and upgradation of their sort of, their sort of, oil extraction sort of paraphernalia, could be very easily doubled, tripled, Imagine what it could have done to the country. So the point is, it's not that surviving is one thing, because but even a beggar can survive. That's not the point. The point is, the economic losses that you have taken over the years. So it has really hurt Iran, and they know that, and that is why they believed it was very unfortunate, because they believed that and I think I would agree with that. The JCPOA was a good middle ground, like Admiral Faisal has said, there has to be a middle ground, and JCPOA was a middle ground, right? And it was sort of concluded after painstaking negotiations of many years, and it has satisfied all the parties more or less. Of course, including the US. It was only when Trump came to power that he changed the US policy on that.
The Europeans were not happy after the US president pulled out. You already mentioned that. What about the European position at this particular point in time? Do you think President Trump would be able to get that very trust of the Europeans this time around, even if Iranians come to the negotiation table? Would he be able to regain that particular trust of the Europeans at this particular point in time?
This element of trust is important. It's not, first of all, to just directly address your question, that trust is not there between Europe and the US at this point in time.
Given the circumstances currently.
Exactly, given Trump's postures and sort of
the style of diplomacy.
And Europe doesn't really trust Trump, based on his last sort of term as well. So that trust is not there. But more importantly, I think that the trust which is really missing and which is essential is the trust, any trust between the Iranians and the US. For example, there's no trust at all there. Any assurances that the Iranians would give would sort of fall short of what US would be required. So their assurances wouldn't really mean anything. When they want, this, and that is, like I said, it's based on, primarily it's based on Israeli wishes, because basically, otherwise Americans, without Trump, they were happy with JCPOA. JCPOA was a good middle ground, right? And it froze their program for 10 years in terms of sort of, reaching that nuclear threshold, and extendable, and sort of, so they could have worked with that. But the Israeli perspective, even because Netanyahu had been lobbying against JCPOA very aggressively. He tried to convince the Americans, he tried to convince the Europeans, and they did not agree. So the JCPOA was done over his objections, But now we see that when Trump came back to power, he did, to the Netanyahu's advice. It was on Netanyahu's prodding that he, primarily that he withdrew from the JCPOA. Basically in the process, literally sort of, kind of rendering it ineffective, or sort of, it was dead after that. So now the point is, the trust is not there, but in this situation, and that is why I personally see this situation as rather alarming, because it could lead to consequences for everyone, which nobody really wants. And that is why it is very important that I think the European powers, for instance, and other important countries such as Russia, Chinese, of course, China as well, of course. America Trump is less likely to listen to the Chinese.
Point in time.
Sorry?
How well positioned is Russia at this point?
Russia, because we all know that Trump.
A reconciliatory tone on part of President Trump towards Russia?
It seems, Trump seems to enjoy a good rapport with President Putin, generally both of them. And, he takes Putin's words seriously as well, generally. So that could be one possibility, because with the Chinese, he does not have that type of sort of, rapport. That is one thing. But I think the European powers and others sort of, and within the UN, because UN was involved in those negotiations as well. I think it's very important for the world to take cognizance of this matter, because the situation is very tenuous, and sort of, and in this situation, miscalculations can take place. And that is why I believe that there has to be some negotiation. There has to be a start to some negotiation, whether it's kind of in public view, or it is sort of behind the scenes.
I get your point. Well, Admiral Shah, your closing comments regarding 2-3 different aspects. Firstly, would Donald Trump be able to regain the trust of the Europeans? And if not, how well positioned is Russia at this particular point in time, given the so-called reconciliatory tone for the time being that we are seeing from President Trump towards Russia? first to these questions, and then one last question I'll come to you.
Okay, I think Europeans or Europe is not a factor in this equation.
But they have played a pivotal role as far as
They had,
JCPOA
but
was concerned.
right now they probably are not a factor between US and Iran, because they are negotiating now directly. They are talking to each other directly. Letters are going and statements are coming out, and then there are wishes and wills of talking or not talking. So they are communicating directly right now. And Russia is right now is well positioned, is in a good position to carry out mediation between both, because as Ambassador Saab has said that both leaders of Russia and US, they enjoy a good reputation with each other, and Russia also enjoys good relations with Iran also right now because of certain factors in recent past. So Russia is in a good position to have mediation between the both, and that's what I feel, that Europe is not a factor and Russia is in a good position.
Okay, unfortunately, we are short of time. I'll have to wrap the show right over here. Mr. Admiral, retired Faisal Shah, senior analyst, thank you very much for being with us on the show tonight. We really appreciate that. Mr. Ambassador Jawad Saleem, former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, President of the Institute of Regional Studies in Islamabad, thank you very much for your time also for being with us on the show tonight. Really appreciate that. With that, we'll come to the end of today's episode. Till the next one, take good care of yourselves.